Mr. Mayor, members of the council, in conjunction with our District Chief of Planning, Susan Connor, my goal this evening is to share. I want to provide an update as to where we are in the study, communicate what's been done to date, to ensure all are aware of our upcoming public meeting that was just mentioned at the Lamberts Point Community Center on the 8th of June. And perhaps most important, convey that everything you'll hear this evening, and I'm going to say this again a little bit later, is preliminary, pre-decisional, and subject to public feedback, which I think is very important because everything we do is collaborative. Everything we do ought to be transparent and understood by all so that we can arrive at a good solution, for that is our intent in this study. It's important that I convey we aren't studying for the sake of studying. We are, without doubt, not admiring the problem. Our goal and that of the study is to obtain a construction authorization from Congress, which, if funded, could lead to a project that's constructed with 65% federal funding. This is the only way to get to the Civil Works dollars. It's important that I note that this authorization does not guarantee funding. There are a limited number of new starts that are authorized annually by Congress, but creativity is authorized and encouraged. The city will have options to use the engineering and analysis that is completed during this study to pursue other public-private partnerships and quite frankly, to get creative. And quite some time ago, we hosted members of the Office of Management and Budget, and this was very much a integral piece of what we discussed during that visit. And I was able to highlight the great partner that the city of Norfolk has been. I was able to highlight that so much of what we're doing is really in addition to much that the city has already started to do on its own. And that was very well received by those during that visit. There exists regional implications. Water knows no boundary. I live in Norfolk, and I readily admit that this is bigger than us. We are certainly first out of the gate. There are other localities that are now interested in similar studies, and what we're doing here is foundational. What we're doing, foundational not just for this region, but I would argue nationally. I would argue that what we're doing and the steps that the city has taken are being monitored, are being watched by other locales. More than a year ago, I went to Miami and spoke, and I was able to brag on some of the things that the city of Norfolk is doing, and it's as a good federal partner, some of the things that I think we're going to be able to do that will be, I believe, transformational in terms of the way we view future projects and as we investigate coastal storm risk management, coastal storm preparedness, recurrent flooding, and subsidence, which all are at play here. I am very competitive and happy to report that this was first. And when I think about some of the things that are offshoots of the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, again, what we're doing, I believe, will be foundational for future studies that will soon commence. It's worth noting that this study has greatly benefited from all the work the city has already done, as previously mentioned. And that work has allowed us to move faster, to operate more effectively, to be more efficient than would have otherwise been possible. The Army Corps does not design to a certain level. And in conjunction and through conversation with the city staff, there's been a request made by the staff that our analysis include a review of protection based on a 100-year event as defined by FEMA. We're going to take that on. We're going to do that. It is, however, important that all understand that as we do that, the results, I believe, will, again, potentially provide the foundation for what may end up being a locally preferred plan, because our goal is to reasonably maximize net economic development. And so it becomes a matter of benefits and costs, but in addition to those benefits and costs, we're going to, as a team, collectively consider issues such as life safety, aspects of the alternatives, risk reduction for historic structures, protecting low-income areas of the city, and environmental impacts as part of the plan selection process. As you might expect in a federal undertaking, there's a process that we're following. This process has several important milestones that our vertical chain uses really to check our work, really to see whether or not we're on track for completion and ultimately a chief's report, which is really that document that permits access and that construction authorization, those construction dollars. We've satisfied the alternatives milestone in October of last year. We've also provided a range of alternatives that we're considering. And we communicated our path to achieving a tentatively selected plan. I want to highlight here that there are many future public input opportunities highlighted on this slide with the star. The first of which will be late 2017 when the draft environmental impact statement will be released for public review. And then again in late 2018 when the final environmental impact statement is released. But we have on our website the means by which feedback can continuously be provided and received, and we want that for the best available information is on which we want to make decisions and recommendations. And I'm really excited about the meeting we're going to have on June 8th to engage the public. But forums like this are also important to us because I think that as those in the city engage you, I want you to know as much about where we are, what we're doing, and what's next. And so our doors are always open, and should there be a desire for a separate session, I'm happy to do that, and I know that our planning staff will certainly provide that for you as well. So the management measures that are currently under consideration can really be divided into three categories, first of which is structural. And this is perhaps the one that you're most familiar with for it's how we modify a floodplain. It's really changing what's happening with the water. Second are non-structural measures, and that modifies the risk, but doesn't really modify the flood. There is no change in what's happening with the water with the non-structural measures. And then, as of late, and really something that I'm particularly interested in because I think that it makes use of nature, and that is the natural and nature-based options, which includes wetlands, living shorelines, etc. And they're not included really on this graphic, but they're certainly being considered in this study. Some of the named features, for example, flood insurance and flood warning, are not Army Corps action items, but they too are being considered in the process. Before I transition to Susan and we get a bit more specific, I want to leave you with this disclaimer. Everything you're about to hear is pre-decisional, not final. We've made no decisions. I am seeking your input. I'm seeking the input of all that live and will certainly be the recipients of what I believe is good work being performed. But I want you to know that these are things that we're sharing now that we're thinking about, and we can only make them better, I think, with your input. And I think it's very important that today, if you forget everything else that I've said, please know that your input is desired, and we have a means by which to receive that, and happy to get it. With that, I'll transition to Susan, and we'll certainly field some questions when she finishes.
Thanks, sir. Good evening. Again, I'm Susan Connor, Chief of Planning for the Norfolk District Army Corps. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and go through some more details. Colonel Kelly has talked to you generally about the study, the place we are in the study. I am going to talk more specifically about these measures that we've discussed and kind of where we are suggesting those for potential implementation in the city. Before I dive into that, I did want to reiterate a great thanks to the city staff that has worked on this. We have been working sometimes on a daily basis, definitely on a weekly basis, with the Office of Resilience, particularly Christine and Katerina and Scott and Kyle, some of those folks in the Resilience Office. It is a joy to work with folks that are so proactive and engaged in the study. That's not always the case for us, so we really appreciate that staff engagement. So just wanted to talk about, I'm about to show some maps of the city and some proposed measures that we are suggesting. Wanted to make sure that everybody understood the language we were using. So up on the top left graphic, that storm surge barrier in New Orleans, there are several areas in the city where we are proposing storm surge barriers. Those are permanent structures across waterways. For most of the time, they would have gates where water can flow through. They would also have a large gate where there are navigation channels so boats can go through. So for most of these storm surge barriers, or for all the storm surge barriers, there would continue to be water flow except for when a large event came and then the gates would close. The flood wall shown here, a flood wall in Norfolk, that is, again, a permanent structure, generally a concrete structure. There are some places along flood walls where there are openings, such as intersections. Again, those would be closed when a large event came. So talking about a strong tidal event or a storm event. Otherwise, that is a concrete structure that remains there. Finally, under our large structural measures are levees or earthen berms, one shown here, the bottom graphic. There is not a lot of places in the city of Norfolk where we can propose those, but where we can, we have, because those are more natural-looking features. They're generally more cost-effective, but they take more space. So there's only limited places where we have been able to propose that feature. So I'm going to walk through in more detail, but just to give you a general overview of the city of Norfolk and what's being proposed, the red lines on here are flood walls. So those are those permanent concrete structures, but that may entail some openings that would close when we have large events. The green lines, which are most prominent, you can see best here across the Lafayette, those are storm surge barriers. And again, there is Pretty Lake, The Hague, and Broad Creek all have those storm surge barriers. Then also along the top, it's kind of hard to see, but we also have beach nourishment and dunes. That's something along the northern beach area that's being proposed. So those are the structural measures that we'll discuss. Also, non-structural measures. By far the most prevalent non-structural measure that is being recommended and that is likely to be implemented is elevation. I think most everyone is familiar with that, raising a structure out of the floodplain. But did want to mention some other ones that are potential non-residential flood proofing. That is primarily for buildings like commercial buildings. Maybe they're higher, you're not going to elevate them, but there are measures that we can take to keep the water out, such as closing entranceways or waterproofing them when an event is coming. And then acquisition is another strategy. I know that's one that sometimes is not well-liked. It is something under policy that we do have to consider. However, it is generally a voluntary program, so it's not generally something where we come in and force acquisition. It's something that would only be done if the city were interested in it. And it's generally not easily cost justified. So most structures are not viable for acquisition because the cost benefit doesn't work there. So when we look through the maps, the non-structural measures will be shown with the purple hatching. I'm not going to continue to reiterate on each slide where there's non-structural, just if everybody can keep the context that anywhere where there's purple is potential non-structural. Those non-structural, usually, they can be done with the structural measures. Sometimes they're done complementary to the structural measures, or sometimes if the structural measure is implemented, it means that the non-structural would not be needed. So now I'm going to go around the city, kind of starting in the northeast area at the Pretty Lake, northeast area of the city. So Pretty Lake, the measure that we are recommending here is a storm surge barrier right along Shore Drive. So you can see it right. It's really hard to see, but there's a little blue mark right there. That would have flood walls to the north and south that tie into that storm surge barrier. And then, as I mentioned before, a potential non-structural that would work complementary to that storm surge barrier. So Lake Whitehurst, this is a backup drinking water reservoir for the city of Norfolk. What is being proposed here, and what we're talking about, is actually this little area over here, this little pink, and it would be raising the spillway and dam to prevent saltwater intrusion. So this is a little bit different than most of the other measures. This is actually keeping saltwater out of this backup drinking reservoir. Pump stations would mostly be required with most of these dams and spillways. So that is a given. With most of these structural measures, you also have to have pumps to keep the interior drainage appropriate. So next, Moores Bridges Water Treatment Plant. I wanted to set this in here as an example of a critical infrastructure, things defined by the Corps as more important to keep functional during a large storm event. These, we actually have a higher level of risk reduction we're trying to provide. We try to protect these to the 500-year event. So there is other critical infrastructure in the city of Norfolk. As we're still moving along this study, we haven't identified everything that, that would be qualify as critical infrastructure, so there may be others, but this Moores Bridges Water Treatment Plant is one that we have identified. The type of measure we would do to protect this is we consider a non-structural, and it would include flood wall adjacent to the plant, tying into high ground. So basically building a flood wall right around that plant to protect that critical infrastructure so it could remain functional for the city. So moving up to Ocean View and Willoughby, in this area, as many of you probably know, we just finished placing sand on Willoughby last week. That contract was completed. This is a measure in addition to that sand placement. We would look to see if either further beach widening or beach dunes would be helpful in protecting that area of the city. So this would be in addition to the sand placement that we already do, would be to see if we would go wider or higher along that Ocean View and Willoughby beach dunes. So Mason Creek, this is a measure that is primarily, we have the Mason Creek community, but the measures that we're considering here are either on or adjacent to Naval Station Norfolk. This is a good time to mention that we work very closely with both the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard on this project to make sure that everything that we're recommending is complementary to their ongoing operations. And if we can provide benefits to the Navy as well as the city, we try to do that. In this case, we have two different areas to keep flooding, because floodwater generally runs through Willoughby Bay over here and into this area. So we have a measure right here to keep water back, a flood wall, and another potential measure right here. As we've worked with the Navy, this measure is right adjacent to their flight path. So a berm here is likely not going to work because it doesn't work with the naval operations. Wanted to put that in there as something that hasn't totally been screened out yet, but it looks like that's not something we're going to be able to do. However, this is a measure here that we are continuing to consider to see if we can keep the water back there. That is something that we would do in consultation with the Navy, and they have been willing and happy to look at that feature with us. So Lafayette Storm Surge Barrier, this is probably the largest feature that we are considering. We currently have 3 separate configurations. So what will eventually move through this process to get to kind of the final analysis is one of those configurations of a storm surge barrier across the Lafayette. As I already mentioned, it's a permanent structure, but water would continue to move through, and there would be a gate for the navigation channel. So it would still keep this waterway open to boat traffic. And just to describe the 3 configurations, so the what we call the outermost is right here. So basically NIT to Lambert's Point, so that's the longest storm surge barrier and really goes straight down north to south there. We have the middle barrier, which is NIT to Larchmont, right here. This one would have a adjoining flood wall that extends down the Larchmont coast to Lambert's Point. So that would be, if we built this storm surge barrier, you would also have to have this flood wall to provide the appropriate protection to that neighborhood. The innermost storm surge barrier is along Hampton Boulevard, right at the Hampton Boulevard Bridge. That is the shortest storm surge barrier, but it has a lot of needed infrastructure to go along with it. Flood walls would be needed here along Hampton Boulevard, and those would be concrete flood walls that would run down the median of Hampton Boulevard. So some implications of that is it would disrupt traffic patterns. There's lots of different ways. We're not to a point of design yet where we could say exactly how. You could close down intersections. You could keep them open and have flood walls that open and close. So, but that potential measure does have those flood walls needed down Hampton Boulevard. And with all of these storm surge barriers, I will say it's primarily cost benefits, but we're also looking at environmental considerations, aesthetic considerations, how it looks, that traffic movement, and there's a lot of historic structures in the city of Norfolk, so we're very aware of that and doing what we can when we consider this to best protect those historic structures without causing negative impact. And this is just a closer view of those storm surge barriers and kind of worth pointing out. So this is where the Federal Navigation Channel is. Not sure if you can see the pointer here, but so that would be the larger gate that would open and close. And in this storm surge barrier, you would just have kind of it would be similar to the existing openings, would continue to be open most of the time. And the type of event, these storm surge barriers, the type of events we're looking at for closure, right now, we might only be talking about once a year or once every 2 years these structures are closed. We're not talking about a daily or weekly basis. Because the frequency and intensity of events are forecast to increase in the future, when you look 25 or 50 years from now, these would probably be closing more. We do not yet know how much more, but maybe it's closing a few times a year instead of right now where it might be closing every year or every other year. So the Hague is another area where we are looking at storm surge barriers. The Hague is the only area where we're actually looking at a comparison of a storm surge barrier, as we've already described, or a permanent flood wall right at Brambleton Avenue to permanently close the Hague off from the Elizabeth River. So those are different options that we're considering. This is one area where we're talking to the Coast Guard to see, their usage of the Hague, talking to the neighborhood, so that this is some options here. Also, wanted to point out that the Stockley Gardens area over here, we're also trying to incorporate some greening of areas to deal with stormwater drainage that would either be caused, say, if we did close off the Hague and we had additional interior stormwater drainage that we had to deal with. Obviously, we would need pump stations, but seeing what we can do with more natural infrastructure in that area to deal with that.
It's the light blue line. I can't read the key. There's light blue lines that run.
I believe that's just the difference in our areas.
It's just a highlighted area. It's just focusing
Okay,
on
just
that
okay.
area.
Yeah, it does not, it's not a measure that we're
Okay.
proposing. It's actually kind of a background part of the map.
Gotcha.
So downtown in Chesterfield Heights, this area, there is an existing flood wall in the city of Norfolk. We'd be looking at potentially raising that flood wall. That level of detail hasn't been determined yet, but definitely looking at additional flood wall through all of this area where the red is. And definitely this is one area where we're trying to incorporate earthen berm, particularly right around Harbor Park. If there is enough area there that we can do an earthen berm. That also is kind of complementary to the Vision 2100 that the city planning is doing to try and make some more walkable green neighborhood areas. So trying to incorporate that where we can here. And this is so that you can see right here, this area, this kind of pinkish color right there is where we would try the earthen berm area. So Campus Stella Berkeley, here we're looking south of the river, and this really is a flood wall in these areas. And kind of zooming in a little bit, you can see better here where the flood walls would tie in where needed along there. So Broad Creek, this is the last storm surge barrier right here along 264. There would be a storm surge barrier that again would operate similar to the others I've described. Also interior drainage would be needed in this area in the form of pump stations. This is a more obviously zoomed into 264 and what a storm surge barrier would look like along there. And the flood wall is adjacent. So that takes you through the major measures that we're considering right now. The way that we will look at this, we've already kind of talked about benefit cost analysis, and we will look at really look how the structural and the non-structural how they compare in cost benefits, and most likely we'll end up with some type of alternative that has some of both. So that'll have some structural measures, those that are justified, but then it'll also have a large amount of non-structural for those other areas. So we kind of already talked about to get to the Chief's report in January 2019. I did want to reemphasize those other things that would be needed past that. We would then be looking, once we send a Chief's report to Congress, we would be looking for a congressional authorization for construction. Generally receive those in WRDA, or Water Resource Development Act, which have been about every 2 years. And then we wait, assuming we get that construction authorization, we wait for appropriations and local funding, and a timing when those things, both the local funding and desire to do the project and the federal funding, come together to move forward on a construction project. So that concludes our presentation. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to present and the opportunity to partner on this exciting study. Certainly welcome to any of your questions.
Andrea.
Yes, Andrea.
First of all, thank you. I think this is a great project. Just to set expectations in terms of where we are, there's a Chief's report, we talked about appropriations. The actual, in the best case scenario, the reality of when we could actually put shovels in the ground or pumps in the water, 8 to 10 years?
So generally we say not sooner than 10 years. The one exception, which we never want to happen, but that does happen, is if we do get this authorized and then an extreme event comes through the area. Think of Sandy, New York, New Jersey. They got a large amount of funding directly following that. So that would be the one exception that we would not count on, but just acknowledge as a possibility.
I think if I could just add, that is very true, that the process and that entire piece from Chief's report to ultimately getting to the funding the normal way. And what Susan just referenced is something that certainly within the North Atlantic Division, we've seen that play through Sandy. We don't want to have that happen, but this study puts projects on the shelf so that should money come available, we have an authorized project that could then be funded. I think that's a very important piece of the importance of the study that is sometimes lost, that absent the study, even with an extreme event, you could not get to the project that you know should be funded and needs to take place. So I think it's a very key component of what we're talking about.
Okay. Tommy?
And that kind of goes along with my question. So Senators Kane and Warner, as well as Congressman Scott, just recently announced a budget initiative to kind of have a competition for infrastructure. And then also with Congress and the President's budget proposal, there may be more emphasis on infrastructure across the country. So you said we were the first to do this. So that has to put us ahead of other localities that if congressional funding comes faster than this, that our deadlines are pretty much in line to when that funding may become available. If they're doing a 2-year budget, I think is what they normally do.
I think I certainly yield Susan to that, because I think that there's a study in Texas that's close in terms of timeline of where we are. Yeah, and then to your point, I think yes, but it would still be that authorization. I think that goes back to what Councilwoman McClellan asked or commented on. Perhaps if they were to expedite that, being ready is the completion in the Chief's report. So really us staying on task to make that possible. It's most important that slide that showed the gates we have to hit with the milestones. And so for me, my goal is to stay within the 3 years and to keep us on budget and on task to make that even possible. So I guess in theory, yes, but it's my understanding that much of that infrastructure is really about some of that creativity that I talked about, the public-private partnerships. And so I think that that's really where that's going. I don't know how much of that will truly be, federal cost share, because I think as you get to that, you move right back into that longer term.
Sure. Okay.
Dr. Whibley.
Thank you so much. This is great and long awaited. When we met with you maybe a year ago, you emphasized at that time something that I think is really important for people and, maybe to get some more support, that with this type of plan that we have, we're on the front end of this. versus what FEMA has done before, which has been fund after a disaster. And what did you tell me, that we could save like a third, or what was there was some pretty remarkable quote that if you prevented a problem that we saved quite a bit of money versus coming in and fixing it.
So I don't know that quote unless Michelle.
Christine, was there?
I think $1 invested is like $4, or it's 4 times as much you save.
Right. So I just think that's so important for us to know and to emphasize and to, you know, because we're one of the leaders in getting this going, you know, everybody's interested in not only saving the area, but to saving some money. And it just makes so much more sense for us to do it that way. So whatever we can do to get Kane and Warner and everybody else to make that message to whatever House of Congress it is, it's really important. So anyway, I love this. And then I'm just going to say one other tiny thing. I hear all the time, and I know all of you all do too, how come we're not doing anything about flooding? I mean, I hear it all the time from people that are reasonably well informed in keeping up with things. And so whatever we can do to really get this message out, I think is really important for our citizens to see and to pat ourselves on the back. Because, I mean, we really are in the forefront on this, and so many people are not aware of that. I know it's frustrating because it's 10 years away or whatever, but at least it's not 15 and 20, which it is in some localities. So whatever we can do as a city to get that message out. You know, I know we've got billboards planned this year, but we could do some other billboards too, or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah.
Amy?
Mr. Mayor, I think Mr. Jim Reddick had something that you wanted to add to it, sir.
No, it's just, the quote was every dollar spent would save you 4 in recovery funds. That's
Yeah.
all. Michelle hit it on the head. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Right, so, thank you very much. Maybe other questions? Andrea?
I just want to make a comment that what we're talking about here is basically related to tidal flooding. And a lot of what we see in terms of flooded roads in Norfolk, I just want to reiterate, comes from stormwater. And while this will help our stormwater outfalls and clearing the path, we still have a very old infrastructure in the city, and that stormwater is also a huge piece of the puzzle too. So while, let's say this does get funded, we still have an issue of stormwater systems that are outdated in the city that we're also going to have to address. And I know that that's something that we're working on, but just we've got 2 issues here. Tidal and stormwater big rain events.
Very good point.
Colonel, one of the comments I wanted to make as we look at the authorization, the federal authorization and the funding or the appropriations, you and I both know there's usually a lag or delay. But if the plan is authorized, we can continue to provide support and also pressure on our federal delegation for the appropriations. One of the things that we're going to have to keep in mind is the local funding, our portion, our share, and the private-public partnerships, as well as looking at some philanthropic dollars as well to help address, our end of the project. So, if we know, what the dollar amount is today, of course, build inflation because it's probably happened down the road. But I do agree that every dollar that we spend in prevention, we save 4 to recover or to build contingencies, building redundancies. So we have a plan A, a plan B, and build resilience. So thank you very much. Any other questions, Mr. Riddick, on that? All right.
I would just ask maybe you repeat the date and time for the public hearing one more time.
Okay, public hearing, June 8th, Lambert's Point Community Center on June 8th, and really excited about that. I mean, we had quite a few folks come out to our last, was it the public meeting?
The last public meeting,
Colonel, can you announce the time as well?
6 to 8 p.m.
Thank you very much.
6 to 8.
All right, thank you both.
Thank you all
Thank you
very much.
Mr. Manager, what's next?